Welcome and afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us at our Fireside Chat. This will be the first in our on-demand insight sessions. Some of you may not know me, so I'll just do a quick intro. I'm Sandile Malinga, Chief Investment Officer of a multi-asset business here at M&G South Africa. And today we're exploring the impact of US tariffs. We should really rather say global tariffs, given that tariff walls are going up all over the world almost instantaneously. Today we're navigating an increasingly complex and uncertain investment landscape. And it's natural for investors and ourselves to feel some level of unease. So while we're fully conscious of that, and we feel comfortable navigating through it, as we consistently stay true to our long-term, prudent and value-driven philosophy. While we do keep our eye firmly on the long term, we do try to take advantage of opportunities that arise as we see value. And this time-tested methodology, we strongly believe, leads to sustainable investment performance for our clients and our performance over time. I'm fortunate to be welcome Gina Schoeman, a friend of ours, as well as Managing Director and South African Economist at Citi Bank South Africa, who's going to share her expert macroeconomic view of the local and global impact of the recent US tariff announcements, as well as probably unfairly some of the other announcements that are happening all over the world, and really help us unpack how they could influence asset allocation and start to percolate some thoughts around portfolio positioning and the like. So I'd like to welcome Gina to come and join us. She's kindly put together a presentation to take us through some of her thoughts. We'll probably go around 20 minutes and we'll have a Q&A afterwards. So we do welcome and invite you to start posting your questions as we go along. Gina, or GS for short, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Sandile. I mean, a smile on my face, it does not reflect, I think, all the uncertainty that we're all facing at the moment. Thank you for inviting me on here today. I'm going to do my best to keep this to 20 minutes. There's so much to say. I've got a slide pack that we've had evolving since the beginning of the year on US-South Africa relations. It actually even started many years before that. But naturally, we've had a lot of demand for the various things that have been impacting South Africa. And then naturally, as it leads us into the tariff announcements of last week and what this means, not just for South Africa, but for obviously so many other countries around the world. So be patient with me. I'm going to take you back a little bit in time, but it is very important to understand the cumulative effect of so much. So let me just quickly share my slide over here.
I guess while we are sort of waiting for the slide pack, I think one of the sort of first questions that come to mind is really, can you give us a sort of 2-minute idiot's guide on tariffs? What are tariffs? What do they do? What are they supposed to do? And so on.
Okay, great. Well, let me quickly just, I'm going to quickly just take you down here. I'm going to go through all of this a little bit later. Of course, things are freezing with me as well. You can see there's a lot in here. So tariffs are naturally protectionist measures you put on any country simply in order to try and protect your trade and make it more competitive. And what the US has done under the Trump administration is try and level out the playing field. And maybe a good chart to show you about this is exactly this one in front of you. So this was the US's tariff problem to begin with, that the Trump administration looked at and said, hey, you know what? These are our top 30 trading partners. This is their average weighted tariffs across each country. And the US is sitting right down at the bottom, charging very little to other countries across the world. as much as other countries are charging, not just the US, but other countries themselves. And so this was just the beginning part of the US trying to level the playing field. Unfortunately, when you do these things very sudden, it does create what we call a trade war, and we're already starting to see that. This is in effect a trade war. We've already seen the retaliation by China over the weekend. And this has a massive impact on global supply chains. For those of you that might be like Sandile and I, who have lived through previous trade wars, you'll know that the unfortunate and difficult part, and please don't believe any economist who tells you they know the exact impact of anything, is that when it comes to trade wars, we can all look in isolation to one country and say, well, in isolation, we know how South Africa would be affected. However, it's the second and third order after that. That is, I don't want to say completely impossible to analyze, but incredibly difficult to try and predict. And you have to run scenarios because in that second order and third order, you have other countries trying to reorganize their own trade channels. And then, of course, other tariffs going up or down with other types of protectionist measures, such as trade barriers, subsidies, etc. So that's why this has created just such unbelievable uncertainty across the world.
Chaos.
Sandile, would you like me to start at the beginning now and just give you a quick
go ahead.
soundbite on where this is all started to come from? So I'm going to concentrate on South Africa in the beginning, and then we're going to span out to a lot of countries around the world. But very quickly, this is what we call our Citi Macro Monitor. There are lots of dates and lots of events here, and we look at them because these are the kind of events and dates that naturally can create a reaction in the currency, confidence, sentiment, bond yields. It's the blue ones on here that are the geopolitics. And you can see we've already been through some of these. And so these are at least known dates that we can look to and go, oh, something might be happening there. I want to bring your attention to the very first part of this timeline. Now, this is going not as far back as we could, but this is going back to Trump's first term as president of the United States in 2018. And if you look at that first bullet, you'll see his first tweet about the land expropriation in South Africa. So this is obviously been a point of aggravation for Trump's administration from back then and has carried on even through the Biden administration because of the many things that we see listed on this page and, might I add, listed on this page. And I do note that this is not exhaustive. There is a lot on here that I have not necessarily gone into detail enough. But where this ends up is the final bullet on the second slide. Just last week, after the tariffs, we saw the US introduced by Congressman Jackson, the US-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act of 2025. I've got all of the links here, and I'm very happy to share these slides with you afterwards. But if you click through to that bill, you'll see the details about everything the US has been investigating on South Africa for many years now. And the risk here is that the bill, it says explicitly that it is looking at ANC political officials and with the potential to put secondary sanctions on these individuals, depending on how this review and investigation pans out. Now, naturally, you can imagine, that is not just a risk premium for South Africa, given that the ANC is a large part of our government, but with what's going on in the GNU, that can complicate things even further. The timeline to monitor, as I mentioned, US-South Africa summit's already come and gone. The Liberation Day, America First trade policy is also come and gone. But there are now some events for the rest of the year that we can look at, and we can at least know that these could be aggravation points for the Trump administration. For example, if it goes ahead, because no one really knows for sure what's happening with AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Forum in the DRC. But if AGOA is still alive, if AGOA is still on, if it's still legitimate, then we are going to have the AGOA Forum in the DRC in June. There will be a BRIC summit in Brazil in July. The AGOA reauthorization is at the end of September. And then really just the cherry on top here, ironically, is that in November, we've got now confirmed, and there was some suspicion about this, that the US has actually said they will take on the G20 next year. And so we will have Cyril Ramaphosa handing over the G20 in person to Donald Trump by the end of the year. All of these are just known events where you could have an aggravation point and the US could tweet, formally say something, or retaliate or criticize South Africa or any of those other countries very quickly. And I should have said this up front. what we're putting here is we're taking less opinion and views of ourselves. This is purely as many facts as we put together. We are not siding with one political party or the other. And none of this really from our side entails any investment advice. That's for all of you to do. But the expropriation bill has naturally been a massive aggravation point. You saw this from the first tweet that Donald Trump put out back in 2018. Now, you'd be hard-pressed as anyone in South Africa who would go to any law firm's website without getting a full analysis from a legal perspective as to the expropriation bill that has been signed recently by Cyril Ramaphosa. And the bottom line here being is it really dangerous? And South Africa is saying, well, it's not really that dangerous. It could be in the wrong hands. But then, of course, you've got the US and the Trump administration saying, no, but this looks absolutely terrible. Well, let me tell you from all of our interactions with US officials, particularly the US Embassy in South Africa last week, that the part of this that is really, really important to understand is what I've highlighted on this slide. The core issue of South Africa's expropriation bill with the Trump administration is the term null compensation. The US feels very strongly, if you look historically into their expropriation policies, which fundamentally talks about just compensation. They feel absolutely strongly about this. And I'm not saying that South Africa should change this. I'm not saying the US should try to persuade South Africa to change this. What I'm trying to just explain here is that it comes down to that definition. And whatever South Africa decides to do in terms of its diplomacy and its relations will come down to that core issue of the expropriation bill. The last part to say about this, and this could be another aggravation point, depending on how things go, is what I've highlighted on this slide. The act has been signed and published in the Government Gazette. However, its date of commencement has not yet been proclaimed. That means it hasn't yet been implemented. Now, that's very important. Exactly, Sandile. Once that finally happens, and it's obviously in the paper, in the media, well, you can only imagine that we're going to get a tweet, or I don't know what you call a tweet on X nowadays, but you're going to get some type of comment as a result of that, depending on how all of these conversations have gone. US aid, I'm going to skip over. I think everyone knows the story very well. South Africa can afford it. And now that it has to obviously fund it itself, it can look for alternative funders. However, the operational side and actually distribution of these HIV medications is obviously what's concerning everyone. Let's talk about trade and tariffs now. So I'm going to give you some South Africa details, and then I'm flipping into what has recently been announced and regional coverage. So the issues at hand here. South Africa, because, and we can largely put this down to the 10 plus years, especially under the Zuma administration, where there was no economic planning or very little economic planning and lots of underinvestment, Eskom, SOEs, Transnet, etc. South Africa equally invested in its foreign policy and trade relations. In other words, this is not about money. This is about making the time and effort to make sure we had people in our big trading partners, not just the US, the UK, you could also argue, there's been a lot of criticism there, in order to keep relations up. So already South Africa the US has criticized South Africa quite vocally, that while it has tried to engage for many years now, South Africa has not been willing to, and they've struggled to find people in South Africa to engage with.
Yeah.
The US has had a trade deficit with South Africa that has been widening. South Africa has been trading more with China than with the US. Reciprocal tariffs before Liberation Day were actually quite material for South Africa relative to other countries. And so this is a relative story in some ways. In other words, what has happened on the trade and tariff stage has hit South Africa because of South Africa's grouping in global trade and tariffs. But at the same time, we have that secondary angle, which is the US criticizing South Africa's domestic policies. That's what's quite unusual. We're still doing a bit of a survey around emerging markets in our team, but so far it's Romania, Guatemala, Venezuela, and South Africa that we can find that the US administration, Trump administration, has actually exuded a lot of effort in criticizing domestic policy. So that's quite uncommon, and that's not something that is a global phenomenon. South Africa has typically had 3 trade regimes. So we've had the WTO, most favored nations, and that's most of South Africa's exports to the US. Then you've got AGOA, and then you've got the general systems of preferences. Quick map, these are all of our trade regimes around the world. I'm not going to go into it in a great amount of detail at all, but it'll be there when I send you the slides and you can go through it. So how did we get to this point of Liberation Day, and especially the tariffs that South Africa has now received? Well, the starting point is the US makes up just under 10%, so roughly 9% of South Africa exports. Now, what you immediately notice from the top left-hand chart is that, yes, China's the next biggest trading partner and the biggest trading partner at just under 10%. But you'll see that South Africa actually has quite a diversified export sector. There's no country that has more than 10% of our exports going towards it. Now, that's an important point because naturally, as the world order and everyone's trade arrangements start to change around, South Africa is going to have to think about that and look at its other relations if there is anything that now needs to be substituted from the US. Look at the bottom left-hand chart. What do we export to the US? Well, you can see a big share between mining and manufacturing. And then what's really important, and this is where the tariffs start to matter a lot, bottom right-hand chart. This is the share of imports of each critical mineral that the US imports from South Africa. So what I'm showing you in this is that 98% of the chromium ore that the US imports from the world comes from South Africa. You can see platinum on there. All of these critical minerals do not fall under the tariff necessarily. Yeah. So that's what's so important here. And that's why later on
this is quite a departure from the last Trump trade war 1.0.
Well, yes. No, I mean, there are many differences I would argue about Trump 1.0 versus Trump 2.0. I mean, this time around, it is far quicker. It's far more aggressive. It's far more tactical in a way. It's almost as if Trump 1.0 was just testing the landscape to see how things reacted and got aggravated.
It was a dry run.
Exactly, a dry run, a practice, not necessarily knowing whether they would secure a second term to do the full the full might of what we've seen so far. I showed this to you. So this was the problem the US was sitting with, and this is what they wanted to start to balance out. And this is where it gets really interesting for South Africa and the countries that were worst hit from Liberation Day. So if you look at the top right-hand chart, these are the trade deficits that the US was running with various countries over the years. I've highlighted South Africa for you here, but you can see for so many countries, the trade deficit the US was running with was getting larger and larger. So the first thing you did was take those countries. Second thing you did was say, of those countries that the US was running this trade deficit with, especially getting larger, which of those countries were now trading more with China than with the US, which takes you to the bottom left-hand chart. And you can see a much larger share of countries trading more with China than the US, and South Africa's within that. But this is where the reciprocal tariffs started to come into play. And also this is what made them so baffling. If you look at the bottom right-hand chart, before Liberation Day, you'll see the gap between some countries of what they were charging the US versus what the US was charging them. I mean, you can see I've highlighted South Africa there. We had an average tariff charged to the US of 7.5%. The US was charging South Africa hardly anything. But that gap made us concerned because that gap started to show up alongside Thailand, Indonesia, Argentina, Philippines, Brazil. There were many other countries, but that's what started to regroup these countries from the trade deficit to the trade with China to now the reciprocal tariffs.
But and what sort of goods are we tariffing from the US?
The imports of which? It's very much, it is a lot of vehicles. It's a lot of vehicle parts that we're not actually exporting ourselves. There is some agriculture, though. Chicken, we've had a chicken issue before with South Africa and the US back in 2016.
Brazil.
Exactly, the anti-dumping rooms. But there's also a lot of technology. They call it manufactured technology that South Africa was charging a lot on. And, whether it was costly for the US or not, we haven't been able to drill down into that. Technology exports from the US to South Africa, you could argue, would be relatively, with a tariff on top of that. There was still a market formed here for it. Otherwise, the tariff would not have been fair enough to create a market. So, it's not as if South Africa's tariffs charged on those US goods was necessarily enough to keep them out of South Africa. So, I guess it looks big on that graph, but it wasn't big enough to stop a market from being formed. And then, of course, before Liberation Day, we got the aluminium and steel tariffs and vehicle tariffs that were announced. And to give you a sense of the impact on South Africa and some countries of this already, the bottom left-hand chart here shows you the steel and aluminium tariffs and the exposure that these countries on this chart have to the US and these tariffs. And you can see across emerging markets, South Africa actually does stand out as one of the more exposed with the steel and aluminium, which we know about, right? It makes up those mineral exports to the US, but it's still relatively small, 0.3% of GDP. What I will warn you, though, is that I'm going to give you a lot of point something, and it's if you start adding it up, for a country that struggles to grow at 1%, it starts to matter a lot.
Chipping away, yeah.
Absolutely. So, what is the share of the imports that come from South Africa that we send to the US? Why are these vehicle tariffs really probably the most existential crisis so far for South Africa from the Trump administration's move on tariffs or what would have been a move on AGOA? And I would say that the auto sector in South Africa is probably our best gauge to see how the US situation, tariffs, trade barriers could really start to impact other sectors, just as because it's the first shock that we're really going to see. And if you look at the share of imports that come from South Africa to the US, you can see how much of our auto manufacturers, all the way, it's gearboxes, it's parts, it's original equipment, it's actual vehicles, which we know also from BMW and Mercedes. So it is, we could argue, and I'll show you some numbers again, point something of GDP, that would argue that still the impact on South Africa is relatively small versus other countries. But for some sectors in South Africa, it is going to be
devastating. Yeah.
Devastating and meaningful. Now, here's one quick slide on AGOA. I think it's consensus at the moment. There's two consensus views at the moment. I struggle to find anyone I speak to, whether they're US officials or South Africa officials and when I say US officials, South Africa just seems like it's going to exit AGOA, either voluntarily or it will be kicked out. No one really knows what's going on with AGOA since these tariffs were announced, because the tariffs are greater, obviously, than any benefit.
Effectively, they nullify AGOA. Yeah.
Exactly. But the agreement still exists, and there could be a renegotiation of what AGOA means, and that's potentially why the forum might still go ahead, because there are countries on this continent that need it so badly. They benefit so much from it, but we're trying to work out now the effective tariffs from Liberation Day versus AGOA. But just to give you a sense here, AGOA was so highly concentrated to the transport industry, and then to a degree agriculture, a bit of chemicals. Transport was highly concentrated to two big manufacturers. They're all out in the paper. We can say publicly that BMW, Mercedes, they've been quoted a lot more recently. And that's because, look at BMW, 97% of the X3s are manufactured in South Africa. But it's not just about that. It's also just the supply chain involved. So I can sit here and tell you that, being kicked out of AGOA would have been 0.1% of GDP, maybe with a little bit more of an indirect effect. You could push it up to 0.1, 0.2% of GDP at most. But from a top-down perspective, it doesn't seem like a lot. From a bottom-up perspective, it naturally impacts the Eastern Cape as a province, potentially the local municipal elections next year because of that. And you get all these other ramifications that would be hard to quantify at the moment. Liberation Day. So when I told you those tariffs were baffling, what I meant by that is if South Africa was calculated to be charging 7.5% tariff to the US, then how on earth did we get to a point where on Liberation Day last week, Wednesday, the US announced that South Africa was actually charging 60%.
Yeah.
And they would actually just halve it and make it 30%. Well, turns out that despite Citi and countless other think tanks, banks, research teams putting their best thought and technicalities into what could possibly transpire, it actually ended up being very simple. And it's being criticized as not the exact way you should be going about it. The formula that you see on the slide is effectively how the US came up with South Africa's 60% and then halving it to 30%. And for every other country, it takes the US's bilateral trade deficit with country X, so with South Africa, divides it by the imports from that country, which gives you 60% for South Africa, and then it divides it by 2, which gives you 30%. And just quickly looking at this table, which I'm sure most of you have seen, we've just put it in descending order. The Trump tables were interesting because they weren't in any order, alphabetical, chronological.
Yeah,
I'm not sure how they came up with that list, but you can see South Africa there, 30%. It's above the 21% average weighted tariff that came out of Wednesday's announcement. And maybe to just give you a sense, I mean, poor Lesotho really did get hit hard, but in kind of the sense of how did this hit globally, worse than expected. So 10% minimum was expected. It was well beyond the top 15 trading partners, and it has a faster implementation than what was expected. So I mentioned there was that average tariff of 21% from that. What we're trying to work out now is the effective tariffs across countries, and I'll get to that next on South Africa. But Factory Asia, as referred to, was worst hit. Their reciprocal tariff was 31%. Then, of course, we've already seen the retaliation from China because they were hit with 34%. But then there were some very strange things. And I mean, in Asia, for example, you had some really small trading partners of the US hit with extremely large tariffs. But if you dig
there's an
deeper,
island of penguins that was hit, wasn't it?
There's a part of Chinese trade diversion routes to the US through that.
Through McDonald's Islands.
Yeah. as I believe there are, but sometimes, unfortunately, some countries just got stuck in the equation itself.
Right.
So,
Gina, I'm just mindful of time. Yeah. Should we?
I wanted to show you Should I show you the impact of this on South Africa very quickly? It's my final slide.
Yep. There we go. There we go.
This is the one. So this is our most recent estimate from this morning. Happy to share the report with all of you too. I'll forward it to Sandile. He should have it in his inbox. But what we've done over the weekend is we've taken the US tariff shock to those countries in the table. We've also factored in, of course, the retaliation now of China shocking the US with 34%. And we've tried to update this across countries to see what the estimated impact would be to GDP per country. And there I've highlighted South Africa. It looks like it's very small, but I want to add, and this is very important, this is only the direct impact. This is not factoring into account the risk sentiment of EMFX risk off, and particularly from US-South Africa relations, not to mention our domestic politics. Just as a last point, this is important, and I'll stop sharing. The 30% that we were hit with, and this is a crude way of saying this, it's effectively about 15% for South Africa, because some goods are sitting at 0 and some goods are sitting at 30% still. So I say crude because those being hit by 30% are not going to take this easily. And then, of course, you've got critical minerals and some other goods that will still be sitting at 0%. Yeah. So maybe just on that note, let me stop sharing, and I'll happily share all of this with you.
Thanks, Gina. Yeah, I mean, I guess unfairly, 30 minutes isn't nearly enough time to ventilate some of these. But I guess, some of the questions that have come through, focusing more on the sort of asset allocation side of things. The first question I have, and you can tell me you can't answer this for various reasons, but I mean, what is the optimal response to this from various countries? What should these countries do? Do you think that whatever they do is enough to offset the initial shock and massive increase in economic uncertainty?
No, I don't think we can offset that because everyone's scrambling. This is that second order and third order of the trade wars that are it's because no one can figure it out. It would be wonderful if everyone could come around the table and decide, what would be the best strategy going forward, but there have to be winners and there have to be losers. And, this is why it's so difficult. Some countries like China, for example, would have been waiting to retaliate, and they do have the means to do so. But other countries cannot do that. They're either not organized enough to do so, and they also just don't simply have the means. Unfortunately, a lot of Africa countries fit within that. This is very David and Goliath. To retaliate against such a large trading partner can sometimes leave you so worse off purely from a sentiment perspective. So whether it's retaliating with tariff or any other protectionist policies, and then also, as I mentioned, reorganizing trade. South Africa does have an advantage, as I mentioned, of already trading well with the rest of Africa, and then also with Europe and parts of Asia. And that's something that I do hope that our government is looking at, not to necessarily substitute the trade. It would be hard to say South Africa doesn't need the US. The US has far more presence in South Africa than China does at the moment. You can't cut it off. Chinese companies are by no means as many as US companies in South Africa, and the scale of US companies is large. FDI flows, investment in South Africa and beyond, but South Africa's got an advantage, for example, right? There are some minerals and some things the US needs from us. There's Sibanye Stillwater, there's Sasol. They're all based in the US. So there are some lobby groups that might soften the blow for South Africa, and you could see that probably reflected across some other countries. But it is chaos.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think this sort of thing should be, sitting squarely with the World Trade Organization, for example. Where are they in all of this? And, are they almost redundant?
The US is trying to make them, or at least makes them feel more redundant. I do think it's important that the IMF meetings happening in DC at the end of April conclude first, because that also is a huge part of uncertainty for so many countries. And naturally, they'll be wanting to look at what the US response is going to be because it's a big contributor. And I don't know the exact percent here, but it's a very large contributor to both the World Bank and the IMF when it comes to funding. And naturally, when it comes to trade, that is very important. I mean, this is where Africa, again, is hugely vulnerable. You've had some countries on IMF programs that have been hit very hard by these tariffs. So we haven't had a huge response from the WTO yet. But I also believe that's because we're scrambling as a world. And I cannot tell you with any certainty, Sandile, whether that scramble takes 1 month or 3 months or 6 months. But it does typically, from previous cycles we've seen with trade wars, it does take quite a long time for things to settle. And here's the other thing. The Trump administration is so highly unpredictable and naturally transactional. And so you can't just go with a view that is going to settle and then be business as usual after that.
Right. So you basically can't take a strategic approach. Right. Got it. Gina, there's a question for you and a compliment. Great presentation. Thank you. Can you expand a little bit on the leverage South Africa has around the export of rare minerals in their trade negotiations? Are we able to simply switch it off if, we're not reaching consensus, or, is that sort of thing not quite possible?
Well, look, it's possible. Anything is possible, but realistically possible is what you want to really think about here. As I mentioned, at the end of the day, no matter what happens to the future of trade with the US, South Africa still has very large and significant US presence in South Africa, particularly institutional flows, FDI flows, and then, of course, as I mentioned, US private sector, and through obviously other supply chains. So those diplomatic relations are very important. So naturally, it would probably not be good to try and retaliate by just cutting it off. And with South Africa would be very, very hard done by to lose those trade routes to the US. This is where South Africa can negotiate and try and appease some of the tension that has arisen. But again, I can't give you a huge amount of certainty on the timeline now, because there is this bilateral review act ongoing. And we also know that even if South Africa now wants to repair some relations, it's not very easy for South Africa's government to get those meetings in DC anymore.
Yeah. And I mean, from your chats with, some of your key contacts within, the Ministry of Trade and Industry, or even within the presidency, what's your sense? I mean, is there a sort of sense of urgency and people being alive to the fact that this could be incredibly chaotic for the Eastern Cape, for example?
There is, but there's also a sense that South Africa is underinvested in both its trade strategy and its foreign diplomacy for quite some time. And so I know that our president earlier on this year said we will not be bullied, and I still believe that they take that stance, but they almost have calmed down slightly in regards to it, which means that you don't necessarily have to retaliate, but South Africa seems to want to remain as neutral as possible, but have to do some very hard negotiations, which is why the ambassador placements are very important. I mean, I'll give you one quick, the US has mentioned this many times in discussions we've had with various US officials, but this goes as deep as the US being aware that South Africa only votes alongside it 17% of the time in UN votes. And again, this doesn't mean South Africa has to side with the US. South Africa must decide to do what it wants to do. But I'm trying to explain the detail to which this animosity and these tensions have actually hit when it comes to US South Africa.
Yeah, so it goes far beyond tariffs and
it does.
Initial headlines. Okay, I think we have 3 minutes left, so I'll sort of pick, one question which is quite interesting. You've given us a sense of what the impact of tariffs could be on GDP. Do you have any sort of first order approximations of what it could do to employment, to the rand, to trade volumes? Or is it still too uncertain?
No, we've got some very initial, and I say initial because all these estimates seem to be changing from one week to the next. But within our GDP estimates, we also looked at the value add of exports. I just want to get the exact work we did on this. Again, South Africa's not as badly hit as everyone around the world.
It's not like Vietnam, which, is...
No, not at all, thankfully. But still, it's a big enough amount that it drags down potentially. And sorry, now I can't seem to find it with my spreadsheets. It's in the report that we put out this morning. It's still big enough that for a country that's struggling to grow at 1%, it's meaningful. Every 0.2 percentage points matters, because just last year at 0.6, we would have given a lot for 0.4 percentage points on top of that to take us up to 1. So it is. And then the CPI impact, it's not that easy to model, because naturally when you're modeling these impacts, you imagine that GDP down means CPI down because of the output gap and because of depressed demand. However, what we now further modeling this afternoon, so we did that this morning, is because of exactly what you said, the rand dollar impact and the risk premium on top of that. I mean, giving a rand dollar at this stage, the random dollar at this stage, is obviously a very difficult one. But we have to revise our EM forecast, obviously, very harshly. We just hit 1950. I mean, who would have thought that? Yeah. There is a psychological barrier around 20 against the dollar. I even remember through the pandemic, that it seems to be a part that it with fair value sitting somewhere around 17.20 against the dollar, if you just do the modeling work, not take into account the last 2 months. That seems like a reach. And so it's usually at those levels that the technical suggests you're going to come back. Then again, we've got huge unpredictability in the GNU at the moment. One could almost argue that what's happened with the rand dollar over the last week could be attributed more to what's going on with domestic politics in South Africa than the relative play in Trump tariffs that has been seen.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, every basis point counts. One last question, Gina, if we can, before we wrap up. This is a question that I saw on Twitter over the week. From a practical standpoint, how is it possible that they are going to have to do, bilateral negotiations, trade negotiations with 30, 40 countries? How is that possible? Or should we read into this as this is the first shot across the bow? They want people to come to the negotiating table with something sensible, and they'll simply switch off the tariffs.
So more likely the latter, what you just said, but not just switch off the tariffs. In other words, from that very straight linear line I showed you from the equation, it's now up to countries to go and try do one-on-ones or regional bloc negotiations with the US. And again, it's probably the worst time for South Africa to be trying to renegotiate those bilateral trade agreements, given that everyone in the world is getting into a very long queue. And second to that, given the relations at hand. So this is why it'll take so long for all of this to settle. Even then, after that, who knows what the next retaliation may be.
So economic uncertainty is with us to stay.
It is. But again, watch the BRICS summit. That's also a regional bloc that is a very odd one, because you've got India, who's played its cards right. Brazil's got a completely different story at hand. And then you've got South Africa in there with diplomacy issues. That'll be a very interesting summit. And Russia, of course. We've all forgotten about Russia.
Great. Gina, I am conscious of taking more of your time, so thank you once again for joining us, and thank you to everyone for dialing in. We are 2 minutes over, and I do apologize. But suffice to say, we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar, as well as synopsis of the discussion. And my colleagues and I have penned together some few thoughts around implications for asset prices and our initial reactions to those. So please look out for that. I know 40 minutes is not enough, so I do apologize if I haven't seen and answered some of the questions that you've put through. We will endeavor to get back to every single one of you with a personalized response. And with that, thanks again. Thank you to everyone for joining. And yeah, given the uncertainty, good luck out there.